Hello, all. Welcome to the Random Thought Pod. I am your random thought leader, Bridge Lipwatt. And today I am here with Maria Francesca French, a post-Christian thinker and writer, content curator, theological coach, teacher, speaker, and podcaster. Hello, Maria. Welcome
Hey,
to the
Rich.
Random Thought Pod.
Thank you. It's so good to be here. I love it. I love the name Random Thought Pod. I think that's really clever. It's cool.
Well, it's so funny because like I used to have the Wax Museum podcast, which has a whole story as to why it was called that.
Yeah.
And then I had another podcast called ADD Masterminds.
Cool.
And when the website on the Wax Museum was going to expire, like I had a buddy who was hosting it and all that. He's like, "So do you want to take over it, or do you want it just to end?" And I'm like, "I think I'm just going to end it." And I'll end ADD Masterminds, and I'm going to combine the two of them into one podcast. And I decided on Twitter to start calling myself a random thought leader, which I just think is such a dumb title. And that's where the name comes from. So
You know what? That makes it so much better. I didn't realize that you were a random thought leader on Twitter because I'm never on Twitter, but I love that. That is really good.
it's funny. I got into an argument with someone over. They were talking about whether a Christian society is a good idea or a secular society is a good idea, and I kind of was being pretty harsh about a Christian society. And this guy replied to me, and he's like, "And you fancy yourself a thought leader?" And I'm like,
I don't actually.
I'm like, you saw a random thought leader and you thought that I was being pompous about it?
Did you not see the pun in there? Come on.
Yeah.
I
was being silly, but I guess you didn't pick up on it. It's okay.
No, too busy being serious.
So today we are talking about your book, Safer Than the Known Way, a post-Christian journey. It was a fantastic read. And I think it really helped me articulate where I am with things. So the introduction. This is not a book about parlaying one brand of belief into another or exchanging one God construct for another. It's about smashing all paradigms we might have ever had for this sort of thing and finally paying heed to those pesky, undeniable, and enchanting whispers that come for us again and again. This sounds wonderful. Do you think people often get stuck in the parlaying?
Yeah, I absolutely do. Short answer, yes. One of the reasons why I wrote the book, aside from the fact that I knew I would write this book for a long time, I was just waiting for the right time to do so, is that the last few years, especially since the pandemic, this conversation that is being referred to as deconstruction has really risen to the fore. And there seems to be a lot of really great dialogue, a lot of authentic sharing of feelings and safe places for people who have felt like there's nowhere to go. And for that, I'm really thankful. But I think one of the issues within the pop culture deconstruction conversation at the moment, besides the fact that it's not actual deconstruction as deconstruction was originally offered up, which is fine that they've reauthored a word and made it work for them. I'm all about that. That's totally okay. But I think one of the pitfalls is it's a little transactional. And I think once people kind of look back and are sort of shocked a little bit by what they have believed and sort of the harmful marks it's made on their lives and the lives of others, they are wanting to be super quick to rectify that, to change that, to be on the right side of all of this stuff. And so we don't want the angry, retributive, judgmental, hateful war god that lives in the sky and sends people to hell. We want the really nice one, that is all loving and is inclusive of everyone and is for the immigrant and is for, reproductive rights and, all the noble liberal ethos and values that so many of us hold. The issue is, even though that God is nicer and shares our values and has a noble ethos about it, it's still the big God who lives in the sky. It's still a God of person and of control and underlying consciousness. And it still brings with it the same theological pitfalls that the angry God does, because we're still talking about being and objectivity and essentially the person of God. And I think that's where we get really bottlenecked in trying to move the conversation forward, both theologically and practically. And so I wanted to write a book that would address some of this. And so when I talk about, hey, this isn't a book about parlaying one belief system for another. This isn't like tear down your angry God and let's put up a nicer, loving God. I think we can all agree that the angry God is not something we want to engage anymore. We're much more comfortable engaging a loving God. But that's not what this book is about. This is how do we engage faith after God, period, no matter what God you're engaging.
And that's, and I think that's where you talk about like post God, right? Because and I think what really shifted for me reading your book was like, I always thought that post means you've rejected something. When in reality, it's kind of like, well, this is part of what made me, and I've moved on from that. And so it's not that I've rejected everything about God. It's more so like that made me who I am, and I've built on that, maybe taken apart some of it, but...
Yeah, I would totally agree with that. And that is a big passion of mine, because I think also what we're seeing now in, the pop culture deconstruction conversation, and anywhere that these conversations are being had, is that people are really checking their entire spiritual narratives at the door. Like everything that came before this moment where, maybe they're seen differently, or to use biblical imagery, the scales are falling off their eyes or whatever. They're rejecting everything about their spiritual past or heritage. And I'm not asking people to hold on to it because I think it's really good, or that there were good things about it, or that it will be helpful to them going forward. I'm simply asking people to continue on in their story, and that you don't have to reject those parts of who you are. It's okay to look at your past and be really critical and constructive and say, oh, I really erred there, or that was a mistake. But we don't have to completely disjoint and break our stories and break our lives just because we want to move forward with a different ethos when it comes to belief and faith in God and religion and spirituality and all of those things. And, I'm seeing this in the deconstruction conversation, but I'm especially seeing it when it comes to a lot of people who have left conservative Christianity for, atheism, or at the very least agnosticism, or even, we've been hearing about the nuns and duns for the last 15 years, and that group continues to grow. And I think the reason why we have such a rise of nuns and duns, agnostics, and atheism is because people don't think that there's any other option. It's either believe in God like this or don't believe at all. And if you think there might be something out there, well, I guess you can be agnostic, but that's your best that's your best option. And post-Christianity is about elevating the conversation to transcend that spectrum where we're just kind of going back and forth like a ping pong match between these 2 points when the conversation is so much bigger than that.
It's interesting. Like, and I find that like a lot of this is like, I remember when I really wanted the sports package just because I wanted to watch the NHL. But the sports package comes with like 8 channels, and it's a whole lot of crap I don't want to see.
Yeah.
I'm a Canadian. All I care about is the NHL. I mean, that's not true of every Canadian, but all I care about is the NHL. Yeah. And so I feel like, when we talk about religion, and I think politics is the same way, it's like you have to buy the whole package. And it's like, and it sounds like you're arguing, no, you don't.
Yeah, I mean, again, it's like, what kind of package are we really buying? Do you know what I mean? Because, I guess that's maybe another conversation, because, I have lots of critiques of conservative Christianity, but as you know from reading the book, I have a ton of critiques about liberal Christianity too. I think it's a same sort of siloed fundamentalism. They're just playing for the nicer, better team. And they've just, dragged a liberal politic into a very traditional theological and ecclesial setting. And there are lots of pitfalls there as well. So it really, is a matter of like, which package we're buying. Because if we want to engage Christianity, and we don't have to, I've met lots of people who I've talked to through the years, especially like as a theological coach, who are like, you know what, I've searched myself, I've interrogated my faith, scripture, my engagement with Jesus. I really just don't want to be a Christian anymore. There's nothing compelling about it for me at all. And I go, yeah, okay, well, sounds like you shouldn't be engaged in Christianity at all. And maybe you are really a true atheist, and that's totally okay. But so that, that I would say is the exception. Most people want to engage this narrative, but they just want to engage it better. They want to do better. They want to engage it well. And so I think when we're talking about religious packages, it's like, we look at scripture, and I think, liberal Christians do this all the time. They'll dissect scripture based on, empirical realities. Oh, Paul didn't actually write this, and, this authorship is attributed to this person, and it really, they break apart all the historical no-shows and all the, lack of facticity and historicity and all those things, and they just pick it apart. But I think part of the package is, if we're going to engage Christianity after Christianity, if we're going to engage in post-Christianity, then we do need to still grapple with things like scripture and the Bible, and what are we doing as we interpret, and what are we doing as we read and engage, and what does this mean for us? And there's all sorts of questions there. But that's part of the faith gig, is engaging all of it and sort of treading with a whole lot of theological humility as we do so.
Theological humility. I think that's a very rare thing to see. I think that's one of the reasons why, I've been able to go back to church. It was really hard to go back to church, but I found like a small, kind of affirming community. And I feel like the sermons are not so much statements as they are questions. And that intrigues me. And I think it is that theological humility, because I'm like, okay, we're just exploring this together. And it's not like someone coming down with a hammer and saying, this is what you have to see. This is what you have to believe.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
So you talk about that it's not Jesus and you, it is Jesus and humanity, and it's a meta-narrative. How does seeing it as a meta-narrative help us?
I think it always helps us to feel like we're part of something bigger and better than ourselves. And we certainly are when it comes to religion or any other thing in life. We certainly are. That quote was written in the context of me sort of telling my story. So the first chapter of the book, as you know, is really highly autobiographical, because I wanted people to really understand where I was coming from as I wrote this book. And then the rest of the text, while my story is woven throughout here and there, it's really, a theological text pointing people to new theological imaginations, talk a lot about radical theology and deconstruction and, what does the post mean, and what do we do with Jesus with all of this? But that was written in the context of me telling my story. And I remember the first time sitting in a seminary hermeneutics class and realizing, hey, this is so not about, because I grew up Catholic, and then I became evangelical in a very charismatic setting. And so I came of age in faith that was highly individualized and highly personalized. And, there was that whole focus on saviorism and eternity and, evangelism and all of these things. And so for me, it was such a light bulb moment to go, I can't just open scripture and point to something and say, what is Jesus saying to me today? It's really, how do I fit into this overarching narrative, this meta narrative of like God's plan for humanity? And again, this was like back in the day, it was in my early 20s. I'm 40 now. So this is kind of some of the little seeds that started to spark all kinds of new thought. But I think we all sort of have those light bulb moments, those eureka moments that, really kind of split life down the middle and just never leave us the same ever again. And for me, that was one of those moments. And I think just knowing that whatever we believe about God, obviously, there's a lot of emphasis on self-care and making sure we're whole and healthy as we're engaging ourselves in relationships. And those things are important, but also feeling part of like the greater community. And I think one of the great sins of evangelicalism and conservative Christianity especially is that the focus on, this hyper individualized spirituality really undermines the communal nature of Christianity as it's always been understood, especially historically. And we really need to watch out for that because it's done a lot of damage, not only to the disintegration of community, but also to like the disintegration of ourselves. You know, there's a lot of cognitive dissonance when someone goes through a particular brand of Christianity, in particular conservative Christianity, and then sort of comes out the other side. There's a lot of work to be done psychologically, I think.
It's interesting, like the social aspect of what people believe, because I've been reading a couple books, and I can't even remember which book it was that I was reading, but they were talking about how like a lot of people have difficulties when any of their beliefs are challenged because they know that, again, it's kind of like the sports package, where it's like as soon as you like let go of that one piece of belief, it's like if I question this, not only am I like giving up the package, but I'm also giving up the entire community that has adopted the same package, right?
Yeah.
And so I think that that's one of the reasons why a lot of people won't question things. And I think at some level too, though, I'm kind of like, I like what Rob Bell says about like letting people have their trip. You know, it's like when someone's tripping on religion or drugs, I guess. But it's kind of like, just let them have their trip. It's like, why would we need to interrupt that? But I think you're more so talking about people that are already on that journey, where they're hearing those whispers, right? And so you talk a bit about whispers which romance and enchant you and take you off the hook for having all the answers. What do you think? What do you think these whispers are?
Yeah. Well, certainly not audible whispers, you know, but these small sparks of intuition and imagination and vision. And, you know, it's this sense of like this nagging kind of itching, scratching feeling of like something's happening, something's coming, or maybe something has just happened and I missed it, or you almost have like a little whiplash because it went by you so fast. And it's the sense that like you hear something, right? You're out and about and you hear something and you turn around to see what it is, who's talking to you, what that noise is, and it's already gone. Do you know what I mean? But it disturbs you like at your very core. And again, like I said a minute ago, you're never quite the same after that. And those whispers and that haunting and that taunting and that teasing and all of it, it just builds until you're like, I can't go back anymore. I've got to go forward, and I've got to go forward in a different direction. The problem is I have no idea what the direction is, and that is the whole point. And it took me a very long time to learn that. Yeah. So I guess that's I talk a lot about the whispers in the book, as you know, but I think that would be the elevator pitch for the whispers right there.
I feel like I should have been like, the whispers.
Yes.
They're haunting me. No. So you talk about the circles of a fixed system and how they are a threat to our faith because they turn revelation into religion and communion into confession. So there's two components there that I kind of wanted to get into. So how is revelation turned into religion within that fixed system?
Yeah, I think everything just gets really domesticated, and we have our expectations very fixed. You know, we're told stories of what has happened in the past. We are, you know, we have a very conditioned imagination of how we should expect God to show up, you know, in our lives or in the lives of the community, quote unquote. You know, we should be looking for very specific religious experiences, and, you know, it really deadens and dulls our imagination for anything outside of a particular expectation. And so in that sense, you know, something that should be, you know, a revelation to us, again, these moments of like, oh my gosh, this changes everything. And I have never experienced anything like this, and I'll never experience anything like this again. And the next time we have that particular experience, or what in the book I refer to as event, you know, it will be totally different again. So, and if we keep an expectation of the event that we just experienced, we won't be able to experience the next one. Do you know what I mean? And I know this sounds all really confusing, and part of it is one of the things I'm trying to do in the book is take, you know, philosophical ideas and theological notions that I think are very helpful and transformative, but tend to get stuck in the ivory tower of university and academy and seminaries, and really kind of break them down at a pop culture level. Because I think that if people just had access to, more thought and more ideas, not everyone's going to go to seminary, university, not everyone's going to pick up certain texts, but if writers like me can say, hey, guess what, I've done 20 years of work and research and living and risk taking and getting wrong, getting right, and let me deliver it to you a little bit. I think that would be cool, and that's certainly what I'm trying to do. But so I think it all comes down to that, that domestication piece. The same thing with turning communion into confession. And that word confession is an important one, because I talk a lot about radical theology in the book, which is really quite subversive to confessional theology and flies in the face of confessional theology. So confessional theology is traditional theology. It's pretty orthodox. It's everything we think we know about God. Go into any seminary or Sunday school and you might learn various doctrines of God and sin and salvation and heaven and hell and all of these things. Whereas radical theology is more about the unknowability of God, the, uncontainability of God, the impossible notion of everything we have tried to contain in the word God. So, yeah.
So interesting. Yeah, because I know, like, I was kind of obsessed with this idea of a cage and how, like, when you talk about, like, spiritually and ideologically and artistically, like, we can kind of live in cages, and, like, as an artist, like, you can look at it and say, well, anything outside this cage isn't really art. And it's like, and you're missing so many explorations that you could do. And I think what you're talking about is the spiritual end of that, where it's like you're not recognizing anything outside that cage as legitimate spirituality. And so you miss so many experiences because you can't recognize them.
Yeah.
And I think it's like this element of, like, safety in, like, if we just only stick to the patterns of what we know, then we're okay.
Yeah. And I don't even think we know that we're doing it half the time.
No.
Because when we're talking about something like God, like, essentially religion and spirituality is a conversation about, what we cannot see and what we're trying to engage and what we're trying to name and what we're trying to learn about, but that we cannot see and that we cannot not prove in any way. And that's okay. Like, I'm not about proving or disproving anything. That is so not the point to faith or to any of this. But I think people want so badly to understand what it is that they cannot see and understand this God who they've been told loves them and that they should love back. And so I have a lot of sympathy and I have a lot of empathy and I have a lot of time for people like that and for communities like that and for conversations like that. But like you just referenced, Rob Bell a moment ago, I'm not looking to sort of take anyone away from their trip, and I'm not an evangelist for post-Christianity or what I do. Like, my work exists for the people who are, like, wandering, lost and broken and just hurt and trying to figure out where they're trying to go. And, even though they've left Christianity, what awaits them is, like, still a round peg in a square hole. And so, do you know what I mean? Because I've had people come up to me before in, like, very vibrant evangelical settings that they find themselves in and just say, like, are you telling me that I'm wrong? Are you telling me that I'm doing this wrong, that my faith is all wrong? And I've said, no, I'm actually not calling anyone right or wrong. I have no horse in your race. Like, you clearly have a very meaningful faith, a deep and meaningful faith. And if that's working for you and you're satisfied with this is fine. And this doesn't mean I'm postmodern, and this doesn't mean I'm a relativist. But if someone is still so steeped in a particular tradition, I'm not looking to get them out of it, and I don't actually even care. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. And I think that's where I'm headed, and I'm not quite there yet. I'm like, I need to be less worried about fixing other people. Like, and I think what bothers me is I know there are spaces that I go into where people are constantly trying to fix me. It's like, we're really concerned about you. And I'm like, well, stop being concerned. Like, you don't need to fix me. I'm on my own journey and I love where I'm going. And, but it's like, I guess for me, it's like, I still see the patterns of, kind of when people really believe in like a more coercive version of the divine, it results in them being coercive people. And
Indeed.
that bothers me so much. It's like so crazy how like a person's view of God shapes their personality. It shapes the way they interact with other people. Yeah. And I want them to be free of that, because it's like you can see that people do not want to be around them.
Yeah.
But it's not mine to fix. And so I'm like, I guess instead of looking at it from a systemic point of view, just being able to say, why did you say that? Like, you don't need to say that to that person. That was very hurtful. And just to stress, you know, at a very like granular level, rather than looking at it systemically, because I just love to look at everything systemically. I'm like, it's the system, man. That's why that person's so mean.
Yeah. Well, and what they don't realize is that their image of God is shaping them, but who they are is shaping their image of God. We all have an image of God that looks like us. Maybe except for me, because I don't have an image of God. But, I did at one point, and it looked like me. And I thought I looked, you know, like it. And so that's why those conversations, and I'm not like so like high and mighty where I, you know, I'm like, oh, I've been out of those conversations. I'm out of them now, but for a lot of years I was in them, and it was like, this is going nowhere. I'm getting caught all the time. People are trying to like nail me down to answer certain questions and catch me, and you know, throwing bait out there. And it just took me years to figure it out. And I still go in spaces with close friends and family. Well, I guess not close friends. I don't have particularly close friends that are in those settings anymore, but some where you just know that you feel like they feel that you're a bit of a disappointment, which is, or like you just said a moment ago, someone has to fix me, or I'm broken in some way, which is such a disappointment to me, because my journey and my story and everything I've worked for has been so hard won. You know, it's been blood, sweat, and tears for me, and a lot of loss and a lot of grief and a lot of risk taking, and just a lot of, you know, walking through doors and backing up and walking through another one. And so when you feel like the integrity of your journey has been so important and so authentic, and you've just invested so much in it, and you have people looking at you like, oh, you're wrong. Or it's like, you know, but you sort of have to have, again, this is so 101, but like, just have boundaries and figure out, you know, how far you're going to sort of let those people into your life and affect your psyche and those kinds of things. But yeah, it's got to be hard. It's got to be hard for so many people.
It's interesting. Okay, so no image of God. How does that work? Like, is it?
Yeah, maybe that was like not entirely accurate.
Because I'm like, that's a really cool thing. I can't even conceptualize that.
I'm not sure that I say no image of God, but I'm like, well, that can't be exactly right. But then when I really think about it, I'm not sure that I do have an image of God, because again, I see God as, you know, neither existing or not existing, you know, neither here or not here. Like, for me, God is a theological reality that I'm engaging, and I'm engaging it within the realm and the narrative of Christianity. But I am past the Christianity that I am still engaging, which is why I'm not an atheist, if that makes sense. And if I were an atheist, I would have to decide that I'm engaging God in non-existence and as a non-entity and not non-reality. And I just don't buy and trade in those currencies anymore, in empirical currencies. I just think the conversation goes nowhere where God and faith is concerned. So, yeah, I guess no image.
That's so interesting. I guess
no image.
You could write a whole book on that.
Maybe I will. I've got a few more in the pipeline.
Yeah. Okay. So you say that you stop and appreciate the structures that were once literal manifestations of you longing, and now observe the ruins and appreciate the beauty. So, which is a big part of your description of being post-Christian. It's you make peace with your past and recognize that it played a part in who you currently are. So how, I think you kind of touched on this a little bit just now, but how is Christianity still a part of you?
Gosh, you know, in so many ways. But I don't think that they would be ways that people would automatically assume. I go by the sort of byline of post-Christian thinker and writer. It's a big umbrella for what I do, but my first love has always been scripture and hermeneutics, and particularly the New Testament. And I have a huge background in theology, and I love religious art. I have so much religious art all over my home. European cathedrals. I live in England at the moment. European cathedrals are my happy place. They're absolutely, places that I love to be and adore and just find so much beauty. But, and also because I know what it is I'm engaging as I do so. I'm appreciating the human creativity and ingenuity in the buildings and the architecture. I'm, appreciating the artist's paintbrush, on the canvas as they depicted, a gospel scene. I'm appreciating all of the craftsmanship, and just the life and the living that went into writing various books within scripture. There's that part of it, of just like appreciating the heritage of humanity that we can find really interwoven in all of the creative bits of Christianity. But then there's the other part, the really personal part of, I've engaged Christianity for better, for worse, my entire life. And, when I became an adult, or at the very least, when I graduated high school, I was still so steeped in my Christianity. I was really nowhere near leaving it behind. I was still kind of like climbing up that mountain to get to the pinnacle. Do you know what I mean? And so I decided to go to a Pentecostal Bible college. And then I decided to be in ministry when I graduated. And I decided to go to, and everything was so led by my faith and what I thought Jesus wanted for me, what God's will for my life was. If I wasn't in that kind of setting, I might have pursued other interests, non-religious interests, but I didn't. I pursued this. And so, as the months and the years went on and all of that began to change and shape and shift, and I coasted a little bit theologically because I didn't know what I believed. I knew I wasn't an atheist, but this word belief started to become really problematic for me. But even in all of that, I just thought, this has been the investment of my life, and I just don't want to leave it behind. I still want to know how and why it matters for me, certainly, but really out there in the world, communally, for other people. How does the shadow of Christianity essentially still hold the West, which a lot of theologians have been asking over the last 20 years, especially in the wake of the death of God movement, and so many things that have happened in the 20th century to just spear Christianity. But yet, like, it is the thing that still holds really so much social structure, political understanding, geographical boundaries. Like, we don't realize, like, religion, Christianity isn't just this like one little thing, or it's not a little thing, but it's not even like a section. It's not a compartment of, it is so deeply woven. It's like the bedrock of so much, even from just a social and political perspective, that I really care about what the future of it all looks like. So, and I could go on about why the question, why Christianity, but I think I'll stop there.
Yeah. No, it's funny because I remember I sat down with a buddy and he was like saying, and he and I used to be part of worship team together and everything. Mm-hmm. Actually, I'm seeing him this evening, which is exciting. He's finally going back to church, which is, interesting. But he was saying to me, he's like, well, why don't you just get away from Christianity on your podcast altogether? And I think it's what you said. Like, it's such a part of our culture that it's like, it's impossible for me to not engage with it, especially when I get contacted by wonderful authors. I'm like, okay, I'll read the book and see if I'm interested. And I'm like, okay, we have to talk about this now, right? Okay, so I really liked the part where you talked about the "Is God Dead" cover on Time magazine. So that was 1966.
It was.
And you say that cover was misunderstood. And I do remember the context where people are like, man, this guy said God is dead and we're going to be really angry at him. And you're saying he was misunderstood.
Yeah, I think he was. I mean, the death of God movement really turned into, what we know today in theological circles as radical theology, that I would say it is in its fourth wave and looks very different from its first wave, which would have been that 1960s, the OGs of the DOG, essentially. But I don't think it wasn't a metaphor. Like, it wasn't like, oh, like we're killing God and God is dead and we want everyone to be atheists and God doesn't exist anymore. It was literally a takeoff on, Friedrich Nietzsche's parable of the madman, from the late 19th century, that, basically this madman runs into a town square and acts as an announcement, a prophet of sorts. Where is God? He's nowhere to be found. Why? Because you've killed God and you've maimed God and you've killed God by naming him and you've killed God by taking away the mystery and the impossibility and, by essentially making God in your own image. Like you've killed God. Anything that was there of God is now gone because of what you've done to God. And so that's where we get this phrase, death of God. And so it wasn't really a metaphor. It was like a literal reality for them, saying, nope, society has killed God. Like, if there was anything out there that was God, it is nowhere to be found. Now you have, you've pulled it apart. You've completely domesticated it. You've said exactly what you think it is and believe it to be. And now it's just really smoke and mirrors. It's a vaporized reality, really. And, I think instead of sitting with the challenge that was, America, especially at that time, so much more of a religious nation than it is now. Well, I guess that's debatable, but from a statistics point of view, from just a data point of view, it certainly was. And I think people just sort of, the same as kind of it is today, get all up in arms, and they have like this, self-righteous kind of holy crusader war sense about the whole thing, and Christians, Sunday preachers, it was sort of war after that on these theologians and what they were saying, and a big response, part of the rise of the religious right movement of the 70s, not all of it, but part of it, was a response to sort of the death of God theologies out of the 60s.
That domestication, I think that's a great, you keep saying it and I love it every time, because I'm just like, I think that really
I need to say a different word, but that's the word that comes to mind.
Well, and it's like this this deity is something that's so much more than what we've domesticated the deity to be.
Yeah.
And we've lost the mystery completely. And so there's really nothing to be drawn to.
Yeah. Well, there's a comfort, right? John Caputo calls it an always ready with an answer religion. And that's essentially like what we've turned God into, is this always ready with an answer God. And if for some reason God is silent or God doesn't answer, we make excuses by throwing out little religious tropes of like, God's ways are higher than ours, and God has more understanding than we do, and God has a plan for everything, and God will never give us more than we can handle. Instead of just sitting in the tension and the challenge of this God that I really believed would take care of me and that I've staked everything in is now just vapid and silent and nowhere to be found. Like, what's going on here? And that doesn't mean we have to decide right away that God doesn't exist, or we're going in a completely opposite direction, or we want to be atheist, or even that we want to quote unquote deconstruct as it's being used today. It just means that we have to just sit in our questions for a bit and be like, okay, we're not in Kansas anymore. And that's okay, but we're not in Kansas anymore.
Yeah. Well, it's funny. I've decided, I've got a lot going on, and I'm like, I still want to write a book. And so I had this like really weird idea of like, I don't pay a whole lot of attention while I'm watching TV, and I usually spend my time on Twitter. So I'm like, I might start writing while I'm watching TV, because that's kind of my relaxed time anyways. And I like to talk a lot. And so I'm like, I'm just going to type what I would normally talk about. And so my first thought, I was out camping, and I was thinking about like love for the sake of love and kindness for the sake of kindness. And then I looked at like just like the glowing of nature outside, and how, you know, scripture says that like nature declares the glory of God. Or I haven't read the Bible probably in 4 months. So, but but it's something to that effect, right? And I'm like thinking nature isn't actually conscious. Like nature's not sitting here thinking, all right, I'm going to glow to show the glory of God. It's the same thing, you know, where it's like love for the sake of love or kindness for the sake of kindness, where it's like it's got its own life, and that, you know, will show glory to this deity without even being conscious of it. And I feel like it's almost like if we just live our lives, we're going to get on that path of whatever this deity is.
Or not. Yeah.
Or not, yeah.
But we'll be moving forward in either case, either way. And I think that is, for me, that is the post conversation. Is about moving the whole conversation forward. You know, it's regenerative, and it's reproductive, and it's transfiguring and reimagining, and it's just about taking it forward instead of being caught in like this loop, this echo chamber that goes nowhere. And again, like I keep saying, and like I've said in the book many times, it's what we're seeing happen now on both sides of Christianity, both liberal and conservative, you know?
You know, it's really nice to be out of that loop. Like, it's so funny. I have a guy that I'm kind of trying to set up a podcast with him, and he's like Calvinist, you know, Calvinist Christian and conspiracy theorist. Mm-hmm. He believes the election was stolen. Okay. He believes all the COVID conspiracy stuff. He's had doctors on his podcast to prove that it's conspiracy. And I'm like, you're everything that I was trying to get away from when I like deconstructed. And he asked to be on my podcast. And I'm like, I think I want to talk to you. Sure. And I want to talk about your deconstruction, because I think you cease to believe a lot of things you used to believe. So I'm like, that's a different kind of deconstruction. And I'm kind of interested to see where that conversation goes. And it's like terrifying to try to engage in that. Yeah. Because back when I engaged with him previously, I was trying to tell him his Christianity is bad and my Christianity is good. Mm. And I'm trying to actually draw people to Christianity by making it more progressive. Mm. And then at some point I was like, you know what? I don't care anymore. Like, you guys can do whatever you want with Christianity. I'm doing my own thing.
Yeah.
And you know, as we talk, I'm just like, oh, it's so nice to be where I'm at. And I'm interested to see how that one comes together, because I just started writing it right before recording, and I'm like, man, this is going to be a hard conversation, but I think it'll be interesting.
Yeah. I mean, you're braver than me. But, you know, you're also really interested in having that conversation. So I think if you're interested in it and it feels right to you, you know, go for it.
It is terrifying though, because like pre-COVID, I was the guy that could talk to anyone about anything and have great conversations. And the whole COVID thing just like broke me.
Yeah.
To where I was just like, I don't have the emotional bandwidth to talk to you. Yeah. And like part of it too is because like my background is in health. Like I'm an industrial hygienist, so I deal with like worker health and like the different things that could make a worker sick.
Yeah.
Which would be like chemical, biological, or like physical stuff like noise and radiation and stuff like that. So it's like pretty broad spectrum. So when COVID came, I was like, well, I don't want people to get sick. And there's all these people that are like, well, we can let people get sick. And I'm like, I can't even compute that, because my job is to not let people get sick.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so I could see my bias, and I could not be a neutral party anymore.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so I'm like, yeah, so it'll be interesting, because I'm like, it's a big step for me.
Wow.
Because there's a lot of family members I can't even talk to about this stuff anymore. So
I'll
hopefully
I'll need to tune into that conversation if it happens. Now you've got me very interested.
All right. Yeah, it's tentatively titled A Different Kind of Deconstruction, because I think I'm hoping somehow I can make that theme work, because I think that's kind of an enticing title too.
Yeah, very, very provocative. Well done on that.
Okay. So we have George Bush with his holy war. So this is, I think, right after this whole God is dead movement thing. And this holy war had a big bearing in Christianity. By the way, I have like a 19-year-old kid who's in political science now, and he's obsessed with this era. Like, he just thinks this is the most interesting thing, the post 9/11 era.
Yeah.
And so we talk about it. I'm like, I remember living through that, and that was insane. It's
It
like,
was.
well, maybe we can do a little bit of torture. I mean, those people did really bad stuff. But so do you think that this whole like holy war is kind of what resulted in us having, Generation Z being fundamentally post-Christian? Do you think there's a connection there?
Yeah, I think there's a partial connection for sure. I mean, because it wasn't just the holy war, it was all the other sort of religious laden politics that came out of that administration that kind of filtered down to so many areas of social American life. It's funny living in Europe and UK. People always say, oh, Europe is such a secular society, and like, God is dead there, and it's humanism, and nobody's interested in God in the UK. And to a point, that is very true. But at the same time, the king is the head of the Church of England. And there are, I don't know how many bishops who have House of Lords seats, which is just insane to me, because they're really holding back legislation on some really important stuff based on religious bias. And so even though people are less interested in Christianity, it's so intertwined with how the state runs. And in America, where we have like explicit clauses for religious freedom and that church and state should be separate, religion is more tied together in public life than it is in most countries that are secular, but their governments, have the state church entangled in all of it. Like in Germany, people pay a church tax. It's like, it's crazy. But sorry, that was a little bit of a waffle. But it's just to show you like how religious America really is. Like, people don't realize it, but it is an intensely religious nation, and not in a good way. And I think, Gen Z just saw the, anti-inclusion policies, and they saw the lack of hospitality, and, they saw what religious people were deciding to do, like start wars, 20-year wars, that killed a lot of people, both Americans and civilians, the torture, Gitmo, Guantanamo Bay, all of these things. And that is just like a small section of that, right? We're talking about the last 20 years. And I just think they just didn't want it anymore. They just didn't want to deal with it. Something like the nuclear family is becoming less important to Gen Z. And that has also, religious implications, because typically traditional Christianity is so heavy on the value of nuclear family. And Gen Z is saying, well, our families are going to be looking different. There's just so many things that attribute to that. But I don't think that we can look at Christianity today and see the state that it's in without surveying some really important events of, the 20th century that got it to where, because nothing happens in a vacuum, right? Everything is an effect of something else and a result of something else. So the ruins of religion and Christianity we find ourselves living in have been certainly a long time coming. When we're talking about 9/11, the reason why I brought it up very briefly in my book is because it did something for religious resurgence that nobody could have predicted. People became more interested in fundamental religion because of, the jihad and the Twin Towers falling and all of that than ever before. And so while everyone, including social theorists and, cultural experts and, academics, well, everyone predicted that people would be less interested in religion than ever before. It was, it's called the secularization theory, that as time went on and we became smarter, we would understand and that, we need religion less. But the opposite actually happened. And 9/11 was a really big part of that. So, being conversational with some of this stuff, I think is really helpful. At least at, trying to engage where we're at with all of this today.
Yeah. Well, and I'm Canadian, and so I think it's really interesting how Canada is affected by all this stuff, because I think, like, I've always thought it was interesting how, like, I would say in the mid-2000s, you got a sense that, like, our politicians were like, oh, it's Easter. Do we go to church? I don't know. Like, maybe we shouldn't because, we want to look neutral, and it was more like a secular society. But you can see now that like American politics is moving north of the border, and it's terrifying, some of the things that are happening. I'm also making a realization, just as you were talking, that I'm like, that's when my faith shifted to a progressive Christianity. Up until then, I thought, the Conservative Party of Canada is the Christian party. And then seeing what happened with like 9/11 and everything, it was just kind of like, oh my gosh, Christianity in power is a really bad thing.
Yeah.
And I was able to kind of like say, like, maybe we shouldn't be about power. And, but yeah, Canada is just an in-between there, because there's a lot of times where we're more similar to Europe, and obviously we're still under England.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of like kind of that element of secularism, but then there's our Conservative Party really is people who are trying to be American. And it's like, and I kind of see like it's the Democrats in the States, they're trying to be Canadian. And and we got kind of that thing. It's like, can we just flip-flop? Like, we'll give you all the conservatives, you give us all the Democrats. And
and it'll all work out. Yeah.
We'll all be one happy family. I'm sure there'll be no new factions, Okay, so I like that you are trying to make Christianity meaningful in matters of life and the world. My pastor says that imagination is expansive and fear is constrictive. I have talked about this so many times on my podcast. That's Pastor Jess Andrews.
It's worth talking about.
She said that, and I've been stuck on that for such a long time. Do you think that like creativity and expansion can actually get us to a better place?
I mean, it feels like such an easy question to answer, which is absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, I think part of the problem is, I think a lot of religion thinks that it has an imagination, because essentially they're dealing with the unseen, and they're dealing with the immaterial. And so to a point, there needs to be an imagination engaged. The problem is our imagination has been so shaped by, 2,000 years of interpreting what Christianity has looked like, and certainly, who's around us, what our pastor's telling us, what, version of the Bible we're reading, what our parents told us, what our friends, got from church, or, whatever it is. So I think that's part of the deception, is that we often think that we are engaging our imagination, and there is this kind of creative reproduction in religion as we're moving forward. But most of the time, there really isn't. And if you do find it, usually it's being called heretical or unorthodox, or a wolf in sheep's clothing, or, you kind of, name it.
Yeah, I saw somebody on Twitter, saying that's apostasy. And I was like, man, I don't care what's apostasy. I care about what's abuse. And it's interesting how, like, when people talk about apostasy, they're just worried about whether people are in line with this text, and they're not thinking about how, like, other human beings are affected. Like, it's like a vertical there's a TikToker, and she's got the coolest glasses ever. And I can't remember her name, but she did this whole thing explaining horizontal morality versus vertical morality. And vertical morality is kind of like appealing to authority and saying, well, God says it's wrong, so it's wrong. Whereas like horizontal is where we actually look at how our actions affect other humans.
Yeah.
And that whole apostasy tends to ignore abuse.
Yeah.
And I think that's where I'm like, I don't know if I can totally be okay with people having their trip, because there's so many bad things that are happening in the name of this authority.
There's trip, and then there's trip, isn't there? Like, it's fine to leave well enough alone until you see abuse happening. And, that becomes a justice issue, that becomes a legal issue, that becomes an accountability issue, that is like a whole separate in terms of people having their trip, if they want to go into church and raise their hands and worship and pray and cry and whatever, fine. I really don't care. But yeah, there comes a point where there's an accountability piece and that you just need to call out. And that would be something outside of the trip, I would say, certainly. But I think, what you just talked about, it really goes back to kind of the status quo of power and, keeping the power in the hands that have always had it. And so if we can use God as our excuse to say, oh, it's not me who's saying this, it's God. It's not like, me saying women can't, be equal to men. Like, it's God. And it's not me saying that, it's wrong to have an abortion. It's God. God's the pro-life one. I'm just along for I'm just, and it's like, no, we have to take responsibility for ourselves and what we think and believe about these things. You don't get to just say, oh, like my God thinks that.
Yeah.
That there's just so, again, it's like that cognitive dissonance of like not being able to really think for yourself. And so when all of this stuff starts to crack and sort of fall to the ground a bit, all of a sudden you're like, oh my God, it's such an identity crisis forming and ensuing. Because all of a sudden, everything that we've staked our identity in and everything we've relied on to tell us who we are and how to think and how we're going to live and what our ethos is and what we value, all of a sudden when that goes away and, starts to, as I just said, crumble a bit, then it's like, well, who are we? What do we do? How do we think through these things? How do we make good decisions? So, the abuse piece, the power mongering, the fear mongering, this all goes back to who do we believe God to be, and why does this God exist, and what is the point of all of this, and do you know what I mean? So it's like once we start talking about whose image of God is right and wrong, this is when we all get bottlenecked again on both sides. So what does it look like to even go past? I mean, if God had an image, it certainly would be love. It certainly would be kindness. It certainly would be inclusion. If God had an image, scripture tells us exactly where to look for that image if we want an image. And that would be in the face of the least of these, like the naked, the poor, the imprisoned, the hungry. Okay? So there's your image if you want your image.
Yeah.
But then we need to go to that locked up, as we say in Britain, done and dusted. Okay? There's sorted. There's your image of God. Okay, now let's have the next conversation.
Yeah. Okay. So I like that you say you are no longer trying to own Jesus. I feel this fits, again, that constrictive versus expansive notion. Man, I really hope Jess hears this. You seem to want to open up what Jesus can be. How do you think opening that up helps us?
Yeah, well, at the very least, it helps us release our grip on everything we think we know. And I think that's always a good thing. When we feel big, it's always a good idea to feel a little bit smaller. And again, going back to something we talked about a little bit ago, of the wider and greater story, and how do we fit in like this goal of like the flourishing of community and the flourishing of humanity and the cohesion of community and the oneness of community. Because if there's one thing that we want to look at scripture, there's one whole, residing and connecting piece to scripture. I think it's the integration of community. We see a disintegration of it in the garden. We see a further disintegration of it all throughout the Hebrew Testaments. And then we see the attempt at a reconstitution of community with Jesus, further on with, the early church. And then we see the culmination of it in this future vision of Revelation. Like, this to me is enough to continue to engage Christianity as this beautiful, again, meta narrative of, we started here, but we didn't end here. And sort of this is the goal. And no one's going to bring that about but us. Like, we're not waiting around for sort of God to return, or to kind of swoop in, as the chief and commander in chief and kind of, take us into battle and win, or not even to use war metaphors, because those are just awful. But it's up to us, this community piece, this inclusive piece, this reconstitution piece. It's up to us. But oh God, I waffled and I forget your original question. Sorry.
Expansive Jesus.
Expansion. Thank you so much. I think that all too often we want to own Jesus for ourselves. The same thing with God. We think we totally, and this is like the joke of the whole thing, that most Christians will say, God is so big and so deep and so wide, and his ways are so high, and his, of course, always his, right? Yeah. But if God really is all of those things, then God also can't be anything that you say, because it's already too big to even put into words. It's just, it's so weird. It's so crazy. Anyway, a very similar thing with Jesus. We have this figure who has split time in two, right? We have BC, we have AD, who has, split everything we know essentially in half, and everything that came before him, everything that came after him. He's referenced in most religious traditions. Again, the whole West was, won and born on the shoulders of Christianity. Such an intriguing figure. Some people say he came to save souls from hell. Others say he came to set the captive free, and we can go on and on with all of these things that Jesus attempted to do. He was a rogue rabbi. He was a prisoner of the state. He was a murdered, insurrectionist. Like, we could just go on and on. But essentially, we're mostly in the West talking 2,000 years later about a very poor Palestinian man who lived in the 1st century as part of, the diaspora, Jewish tribes that were left after, the exile, still living under foreign Roman imperial rule, only lived for 33 years, always spoke in parables, and spoke about parables in ways that would have been understood to a 1st century audience. Jesus wouldn't have been talking about a fig tree if he was in New York City in 2023, because there would not have been a fig tree on the side of the road for him to look at and say, let me tell you a story about a fig tree. do you know what I mean? And so we're so quick to be like, Jesus this and Jesus that and Jesus one. And the liberals do it too. And it bothers me to no end. Like, it's like, oh, Jesus isn't this. Jesus is actually this. And it's like, that sounds really nice. Like, I would love for Jesus to be that. But at the end of the day, again, we must approach all of these things, including Jesus, especially Jesus, with a sense of theological humility. And so at one point, maybe I was Mary who wanted to sit at Jesus's feet and just learn and linger and listen. At one point I would have been, the women at the foot of the cross, and I would have just wanted to hope to, bear with him, to his last breath. Now I just kind of want to be, Zacchaeus, who kind of like maybe hangs out in the tree and kind of looks below, and maybe he clumsily falls out, or, maybe I want to look over the shoulder of Thomas as Thomas is saying what we're all thinking, which is, I don't really believe it's you. Can I just stick my finger in your side to make sure? Do you know what I mean? Like, I just want to, I would have heard about Jesus's triumphant entry into Jerusalem. I don't know that I would have like celebrated it the way everyone else did, but I would have been really excited to see everybody getting on board with a really happy, momentous occasion. Do you know what I mean? So these days I engage Jesus very, very differently, and I don't pretend. I can talk about to really no end the Jesus I see the Gospels giving us. I can also talk, historically about what we see, in terms of sources of outside of canon and scripture, what we may know of Jesus and times he pops up, in extra biblical literature or whatever. But in general, from a faith perspective, from a spiritual perspective, from a human perspective, I think we still need to hold this stuff lightly, and still sort of giving it a little wink as we sort of pass it by. Like, we're still interested. Like, we know there's something here, and it's okay that we'll never see the full picture. I just think that we have this incredible addiction to know. And that is a human story. That is a very human thing. We always want to know. We always want to pursue knowledge and sort of get to the end of it. And Christianity is a really great poster child for that. It's like, hang on this journey with us, and at some point we're going to get to the end and it's going to all make sense. No, not really, not necessarily. And that's okay, because I don't know that is the point of life, and certainly not the point of faith.
And I feel like there's so much more to discuss, but we're like at an hour already. So I'm just going to, hopefully we leave people wanting more and then they have to read your book, right? So
that would be good.
I'm just going to, so one more quote that I thought was amazing. God is indeed dead, and we have killed him, echoes the madman. We killed him by creating him. We killed him by containing him. We killed him by stripping the divine of its mystery, experience, and unknowability. We killed him by relying on a myth of our own creation when we should have relied on each other and ourselves. It is society and culture that have killed God by venerating God and sacralizing our rituals in the name we have attributed to being, an object of our own construct, and, as Nietzsche has asserted, our own imaginations. And I think, again, it's like we've kind of constricted it. It's like fear has constricted it, and it limits the possibility, and it stifles that which is divine.
Yeah, and to be honest, I probably wouldn't even use that word divine, because that would denote a difference between the divine and the non-divine, right? The divine and everything else, or you know, the sacred versus the profane. And for me, it's all multidimensional. It's all integrated. It's all, you know, by turning over the stones that exist in the profane, we find the sacred, and sort of vice versa. So for me, it's not about trying to get at the divine or get at a divine mystery or experience the divine, because that means I'm still chasing something higher than me and, you know, outside of me, and that's transcendent of me and who I am, as opposed to me in my body, living life as I am and being caught up in the whispers, I suppose. And I have a lot more to say about that. People have to go to the book. I talk a lot about Jacques Derrida and this idea of l'avenir and this idea of coming and going and coming again. And I talk a lot, again, about radical theology and what it looks like to engage God from a radical theology point of view. Because I don't want to just talk in like big ideas and make sort of big philosophical statements, but it's like, okay, well, we're open to this post-Christian conversation. What does it look like? And so really that is what the book is about. It's inviting us to a new way of engaging all of this stuff. And rather than answer people's questions, it was written to bring a new conversation entirely.
Beautiful.
So.
Well, thank you so much.
You're welcome.
This was fun. And I feel like I might pick up the Bible again after our conversation, because I'm like, it's just interesting, like, to engage it from that point of view. Because I think, like, for me, just a lot of like cynicism, because I would read a scripture and I'm like, oh, that's why those people are terrible, right? And so I think like being able to engage it and kind of look at like, okay, this is what these people wrote at this time. Now, is there something there that's still, you know, relevant in some way? Like, is this something that I can actually engage with and find something worth engaging with? Yeah.
Yeah, and that's a question everyone needs to sort of answer for themselves. For me, the answer was and is and continues to be yes. So,
wow. Well, that's amazing. Okay, so there's Safer Than the Known Way, but you also have another book.
Yes, came out just this past June. Is called, so this is, we do video on this too, right? You're releasing the video?
Yes.
Okay, so this is Safer Than the Known Way, a post-Christian journey, my first book that came out in January. And then this was the follow-up, Reconfiguring, a collection of post-Christian thoughts and theologies. And Safer Than the Known Way is really like a 30,000-foot look at the post-Christian conversation, as I'm sort of inviting people to it, and what I think was some of the most important aspects to bring. And Reconfiguring is actually 40 short essays, engaging what it looks like as post-Christianity kind of seeps into various areas of our life. So it's like, okay, it's all fine and well to talk about God, past God, but then what do you do with death when you lose a loved one? Like heaven, hell, these are important things. Or, what do I do with theological constructs and concepts like rapture? Or what does it look like when I even want to talk about love or happiness or making meaning? Like, what does that look like outside of a moral, personal God, an interventionist God that lives in the sky? What do I do with high holy holidays, Christmas, Easter, Palm Sunday, all of these things? How to engage so much from a post-Christian perspective. Of course, it's not exhaustive. I can't fit everything in all of life in one book, but I did do my best in 40 essays. So if you read Safer Than the Known Way and you like it, pick up the second one. It'll give you a lot to chew on.
Well, I'm definitely going to read that. So, and we'll have to talk again.
Yeah, we will. Absolutely.
So what's the best way for people to kind of engage with you? You said you're not on Twitter much, but where would people get
if people just want to head to my website, which is mariafrancescafrench.com, it links to everything. It links to my Instagram, my Facebook. It links to all the books. It links to, I'm teaching a few places. I do some theological coaching. I had a podcast that has been on ice for a while, but there are a lot of episodes that people can catch up on. So yeah, anything Wonderful. That you want to figure out that I'm a part of is on my website. So
awesome.
Thank you.
Well, thanks again.